Welcome back. I'm Logan, your host for the Daily Bible Reading Podcast, where we are journeying through the Bible chronologically, taking it one day at a time. Today is day number 89, and we're going to begin looking at the book of Judges today. We're going to be in Judges chapter 1 and 2. I'm excited to get into this book because it is one of the more controversial books of the Old Testament. It starts out nicely, at least for a few verses. We have this promise of what has come before in the book of Joshua. Things look like they're starting on a high note, and then things start going south very quickly. And this book ends on some of the most disturbing imagery that we see in really all of the Bible. How did we get here? How did they end up in this situation? That's what the book is trying to answer. And before we even read a word of this text, I want to make sure that you understand what this judge entails. Remember, Israelites are not a democracy the way that we are. They're not a monarchy, at least yet. They are a theocracy. God is their king. God is their ruler. But they still look to people to lead them on a day-by-day basis. And so these judges are the people that step forward to lead in military charges, to lead by putting forth laws. Really, you could call Moses and Joshua both judges as well. They served in this same function. But they also had the quality of being prophets of God, that they spoke on behalf of God and spoke truth and led the people rightly. These judges that we're going to look at, even the best of them, Deborah and maybe Gideon, are subpar, and then others are absolutely terrible. And so just because these people are in leadership roles in Israel does not mean at all that any of their actions are condoned or approved of or smiled upon. This book is written to be descriptive, not prescriptive. Most of the things that we see here in Judges is not the way that God would have them do things, but it's the way that they have chosen to do them instead of obeying God in the way that He wanted them to go. So, before we get started, let's pray. Today's prayer is from the Valley of Visions, a collection of Puritan prayers and devotions by Arthur Bennett. Today's prayer is entitled, The Spirit's Work. O God, the Holy Spirit, Thou who dost proceed from the Father and the Son, have mercy on me. When Thou didst first hover over chaos, order came to birth, beauty robed the world, fruitfulness sprang forth. Move, I pray Thee, upon my disordered heart. Take away the infirmities of unruly desires and hateful lusts. Lift the mists and darkness of unbelief. Brighten my soul with the pure light of truth. Make it fragrant as the garden of paradise, rich with every goodly fruit, beautiful with heavenly grace, radiant with rays of divine light. Fulfill in me the glory of Thy divine offices. Be my comforter, light, guide, sanctifier. Take of the things of Christ and show them to my soul. Through Thee may I daily learn more of His love, His grace, compassion, faithfulness, beauty. Lead me to the cross and show me His wounds, the hateful nature of evil, the power of Satan. May I there see my sins as the nails that transfixed Him, the cords that bound Him, the thorns that tore Him, the sword that pierced Him. Help me to find in His death the reality and immensity of His love. Open for me the wondrous volumes of truth in His "It is finished." Increase my faith in the clear knowledge of atonement achieved, expiation completed, satisfaction made, guilt done away, my debt paid, my sins forgiven, my person redeemed, my soul saved, hell vanquished, heaven opened, and eternity made mine. O Holy Spirit, deepen in me these saving lessons. Write them upon my heart, that my walk may be sin-loathing, sin-fleeing, and Christ-loving, and suffer no devil's device to beguile or deceive me. Amen. All right, let's get down to business. Here's Judges chapter 1. Chapter 1. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." And Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him, and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. And the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem, and captured it, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and set the city on fire. And afterward the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, who lived in the hill country, in the Negev, and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. And they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sepher. And Caleb said, "He who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him Achsah my daughter for a wife." And Othniel the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, and he gave him Achsah his daughter for a wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field, and she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Give me a blessing, since you have set me in the land of the Negev. Give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negev near Arad. And they went and settled with the people. And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath, and devoted it to destruction. So the name of the city was called Hormah. Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country. But he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city. And they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites, and built a city, and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or to Anak and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ebleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. For the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nahalol, so the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Ahlab, or of Achzib, or of Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth-Anath. So they lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Bethshemesh and of Beth-Anath became subject to forced labor for them. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shaalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Chapter 2. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. And all that generation were also gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord, or the work that he had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods, from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. So they abandoned the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers, who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning, because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did, or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua.
You know, this isn't the first podcast I've ever made. I've done several others with friends in the past, going all the way back to pretty much the beginning of podcasting. And normally it's a very arduous and time-consuming process of recording and editing and mixing and finding music that you can use on the podcast and sound clips and things like that to try to put it all together to make a nice finished product. But Anchor.fm makes that all so much easier. I use Anchor. It is free, and the creation tools that they allow me to use to record and edit the podcast right from my phone or right on my computer, right through my web browser, just make it absolutely effortless. This is an amazing product that they offer, absolutely free. And so if you're looking to start a podcast, looking to get anything going, if you've got a great idea, I encourage you, get out there and do it with Anchor.fm. My favorite part about the entire process with Anchor is that they will actually distribute the podcast for me. So whenever I'm done, whenever I'm all finished recording, I just hit done and I tell them when I want it to be published. And it magically goes out to places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and everywhere else that you guys listen to. So it's magical. And you can even make money from your podcast when you get listeners. Folks start listening to your podcast. As many people as are listening to the ads that you record, like this one, you end up getting paid for those things. And so it's everything that you need to make a podcast all in one place. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, which I would encourage anybody to do, you've got a voice. We want your voice to be heard. Go and download the free Anchor app now, or go to Anchor.fm to get started.
As we launch into the book of Judges, I would really encourage you to take a look at the overview video from the Bible Project that I've posted down in the show notes below. It will give you a nice high-level glance at the entire book so that you can get a sense of what the whole book is about, so you don't get bogged down just in the chapter-by-chapter picture that we are taking a look at. As I said before, we begin in Judges chapter 1 on a pretty high note. We see the tribes of Judah and Simeon going out into each other's territories, which, if you remember, were like a donut of each other, Simeon being inside of Judah's territory. They go and they capture the king, Adoni-Bezek, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Ow. Why would they do that? Well, secular history tells us that this was a common practice to prevent kings from being warriors ever again. Without thumbs for grasping or for big toes for balance, warrior-like activity was pretty much impossible. And so Adoni-Bezek had admitted to doing the same thing to 70 kings or so himself. And we see, however, in verse 8, a campaign against the inhabitants of Jerusalem. But as we get down to verse 21, we will see that the people of Benjamin aren't able to finish the job against the Jebusites that are there in Jerusalem. And so they leave Canaanites behind. And this is the ongoing story for all of the tribes except for Issachar. We don't see the mention of Issachar here on the western side of the Jordan as having not pushed anybody out. That could have been because they didn't have any military victory at all. They may have just absolutely left their people there with them. We don't really know, but we don't see them called out here particularly. They're the only one we don't see. But it really looks as though chapter 2 begins the downward spiral. And it's not a pathway that is bringing us to a lot of new things. As we read the book of Judges, you're going to feel like you've heard the story before, like you've heard the same thing over and over again. And that's because there's really nothing new here. This young nation of Israel abandons God and then begins this series of ups and downs, this cycle of up and down, repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And they didn't just follow this one time. No, it was over and over in their history. This is in Judges chapter 2, verses 18 and 19 that we just read. It says, whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was their judge, and he saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. But when the judge died, they returned to their ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers. And then if we just added on, they would feel oppressed by the people after they had disobeyed, and they would cry out to God, and God would raise up another judge, and the whole cycle continues going. Israel abandons God for false gods like the Baals, which that's a kind of blanket statement for any of these foreign gods. Baal was the chief of the Canaanite gods, but any of these other gods would have worked as well. Baal, Ashtaroth, Chemosh, Molech, all of these would have been other gods that were being worshipped in the area. So Israel abandons God for these false gods, and God causes Israel's enemies to oppress them, and Israel cries out for deliverance. Then God raises up a judge who is essentially a tyrant. He's a deliverer that is raised up for that particular purpose and task to lead the people, to bring the people of God back to where they need to be. And he rescues them from oppression. And then the judge dies and the people abandon God yet again. You've probably experienced something similar in your own life. Under extreme pressure of some circumstance, you cry out to God for help. I mean, even Martin Luther did this. Perhaps you even make a bargain with God, making promises of devotion if he answers you. And when he does answer you, you follow him more closely for a little while. And then as the trial fades out, so does your devotion. And there may be many explanations for the repeated backsliding of the Israelites, but Judges gives us a clue about the main reason. Judges chapter 2, verse 10 says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up, who neither knew the Lord or what he had done for Israel. The people didn't know the Lord. They didn't know him personally. They didn't relate to him, pray to him, think about him, depend on him. He wasn't part of their life. Judges says that the people forsook the Lord, meaning they left him behind and deserted him. It was their choice to abandon him. The people also didn't know the history of all that God had done for Israel. They didn't know the account of the deliverance of Egypt, the miracles in the wilderness, how God's hand had been with them in their victory over the Canaanites. They didn't know because they hadn't been told. That speaks of a tremendous failure on the part of their parents and their grandparents, rather than their own choice. They can't know unless they're taught. And so this is a failure of teaching. We and our children need to know the Lord personally. We need to know the story of what God has done for Israel and for all believers since then. To know the Lord means to enter into a relationship with him that involves faith in Jesus Christ, knowledge of his words in the Bible, ongoing communication with him through prayer, and dependence upon him in our everyday life. And our children need to hear the story of what God has done, beginning in their earliest years. Teach your children Bible stories, but also tell them what God has done for you. Then your family maybe can avoid this circle of loss that we see in the book of Judges. And maybe they can become part of that great company of pilgrims who go on from strength to strength, as we see in Psalm 84. W.A. Criswell said it this way. He said, the real faith The real religion of God binds us to the past in order that we may be ready for the future. And no generation of people can forget their past and be worthy of any kind of a future. And that is precisely what is happening today in America. We have a generation rising up who says, "Oh, that's old hat. This is the old establishment. Let's blot it out." And they live as though time and life were just now. And they're forgetting our forefathers and the God of our people. Consequently, they have no other choice but to give themselves to sensuality and promiscuity and pleasure. It's a sorry generation, a cheap one, for no people who forget their past is worthy of any kind of a future. Thank you for joining me today. I hope this has been encouraging to you. If so, please let me know by visiting the links that you find under the Connect With Us section in the show notes. I'm a simple man and I could use the encouragement. If you've been blessed enough that you would like to support the podcast, I would greatly appreciate that as well. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/DBR podcast to make either a one-time gift or to sign up for a monthly recurring membership gift. Until tomorrow, keep reading and keep worshiping.